Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
We're back with episode 22 of the Leo Training Podcast. This week's guest is Todd Hargrove. Todd has an amazing story and background. He started off as an attorney and then became a Rolfer and Feldenkrais practitioner, all while starting a blog called Better Movement. He also authored the book A Guide to Better Movement, which is a bestseller. In this episode, we will discuss some topics that are hotly talked about in movement regarding mobility, stability, and motor control. We also spend a great deal of time going in depth in regards to the central nervous system and how this is a main driver when it comes to movement. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode. Todd Hargrove, welcome to the Leo Training Podcast. Thank you for coming on to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Me too. I think we have some fantastic material in store for the audience. You've got a lot to share, a lot of wisdom and insight and experience. But before we get into in depth here and talk about movement, let's kind of let the audience know a little bit more about your background, because you've got a really interesting and unique story.
Yeah. So I'm a Rolfer here in Seattle. That's kind of like a deep tissue massage technique. And so I see clients for that. And also I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner, which is kind of a movement-based therapy. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about what that is later. But I used to be a lawyer. So I was a lawyer for about 10 years. And then I made a big switch to getting into being a body worker and a movement therapist. And also I started writing a blog called Better Movement, and I wrote this book called A Guide to Better Movement. So I've spent a lot of time writing and working on movement and stuff like that. And it was an interesting transition.
Very cool. So what led you to kind of make that transition from being an attorney into being a movement therapist? Was it something that was going on in your life, or you just you had other interests that kind of sparked?
Yeah, well, for one of the things is when I was an attorney and I was having some stressful days at the computer and everything, and I developed a lot of chronic pain in my neck and my back and places like that. And I was very motivated to learn about it and figure out what was going on. And I went to some PTs and I tried some yoga. And this is way back in early 2000s. There wasn't that much information on the internet, but I was kind of eating it up. And at the time, I was also interested in sports performance kind of stuff. And I was trying to compete at squash and stuff like that. And, I had some injuries that were getting in the way. I had some pain that was getting in the way. And what I started to read through, kind of physical therapy books or resources and the functional training information that was out there, this was kind of the time when the PTs were starting to talk to the sports performance people, Mike Boyle and Gray Cook and Mark Verstegen and people like that. And I was reading books by Shirley Sarman and those guys. And I can see kind of a lot of overlap between the pain people and the sports performance movement people. And I just got very, very interested in the topic. And at some point, I was very successful in getting rid of all my pain and going out and playing hard in the sports that I wanted to. And so I kind of developed some empathy for other people that were in pain and interest in the whole subject matter, to the point where at some point I realized, I'd rather be in the business of doing something with this than the law business. And so then I made a change.
Awesome. That's very cool. So did your experience, as well as, interacting with the people around you, that's what sort of prompted also you to start the blog and create that content so it would be a resource for others?
Yeah, I think the blog started out not with any intention of that many people reading it, really. I think the main thing that my post had in common when I started was my clients were often, they asked the same questions. Or I see them as me having to kind of give them the same. There's something that I want them to know. A lot of people are coming in there with what I see as a conception or a myth, and there's something that I want them to understand, which would be, useful for them to know. So I'd write something down, which is so I didn't have to say this over and over again. And I thought, I can give this to clients, I can give this to family, I can give this to friends and share it in a small community. And it just kind of grew from there. I think I was involved in some forums and some Facebook discussions, and things just kind of grew from there. More people were reading it and commenting on it, and so I started putting more work into it. But the basic idea was always to just kind of add something to the conversation that was online that I thought that I could make some sort of contribution there.
Very cool. Awesome. So let's jump into the first topic that you and I had down. And that's in regards to the importance of rhythm and timing, and the proper sequencing for muscles, between the stabilizers and primary movers. So could you kind of, I guess first would be important for those that don't know, describing what a stabilizer and primary mover is, and then, go into the importance of how they tie into movement.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not sure how well you can really kind of break down the muscles and say these muscles are stabilizers and these muscles are prime movers. There's a lot of people that have put some effort into doing that. And, a lot of the core muscles are often identified as stabilizers. Stabilizers basically means you want to prevent unwanted movement, and a prime mover would be something where it's generating these large movements. So, the muscles in the middle of the body would be often be in the nature of stabilizers, and the muscles more towards the periphery that really make large movements of the limbs would be more prime movers. So I think a good example of like the importance of like a good rhythmic interaction between these different muscles and timing of joint movements would be something like throwing a baseball. So if you're throwing a baseball, there's many joints that are cooperating to get the ball thrown. And there kind of has to be the right timing. So you know what it looks like. You bring your arm back. It's all kind of cocked and ready to throw. And then there's this sequence of movements of the joints towards your target. It's got to happen in the right sequence. So that the hips turn and move towards the target first. They stretch the abs. The abs kind of pull on the ribs, and the ribs rotate and move forward. The ribs are connected to the arm and the scapula. So the upper part of the arm moves forward. And then very last, the most distal and small muscles in the chain are the wrist, and only then do they flick forward. So it's kind of like a whip cracking when someone's throwing something, delivering a punch, kicking or something like that. And the important thing is for everything to move with the right timing. Then you see that kind of nice, flowing, smooth, beautiful, wave-like motion in people's bodies. It's very efficient. It's very powerful. It looks like what they're doing is very smooth and easy, but they kind of effortlessly generate a lot of power. And, so it's very, very, very complex, all of those different joint movements. And it's kind of, I think, part of the reason why it's hard to capture or assess good quality, efficient movement with simple, objective tests for movement quality like you have with, something like the FMS, which I think is good. But it's very hard to capture the quality of movement inherent in a throw or a kick, which is kind of, it's easier to appreciate aesthetically. You watch someone do it and you say, that looks really good. It looks really nice. But it's kind of hard to really break that down objectively and assess it all. So I think there's a role for like this intuitive aesthetic appreciation for movement that great coaches have. And it's hard to assess that objectively.
Right. So there's obviously some value in using, like a functional movement screen or any type of evaluation process for movement. But when you get into the sport itself, baseball, like that we just touched on, it may not be necessarily indicative of what's happening in those movement patterns, because
some of those movement patterns that we really care about are super duper complicated. Right. Even a squat is kind of complicated, but you can kind of say, okay, on the squat, I'm going to look for these 3 or 4 objective markers. But if you wanted to know whether someone was being really efficient in the rhythm and timing in a golf swing or a throw or something like that, you might have a pretty good sense of it, just kind of an intuitive aesthetic sense if you watch them, say, wow, that's really smooth. But what would be the objective way of assessing that? It might be kind of tough.
What do you look for when you watch, say you have a, student or a client in whatever, sport background they're coming from, but what do you look for when you watch them play a sport? Where's your eye gravitate towards?
I don't get to see I try to see my clients in action as much as possible if they're coming to me and saying, okay, I want to improve this action. If they're runners, I'll have them go out and run. I will take people through some sort of, kind of a movement screen thing, kind of like an FMS, like really basic movements. I have everybody, hey man, show me your toe touch, show me your squat, show me your arms reaching overhead, stuff like that. And then I'll have them do the movements that are really of interest to them, whatever that is, to the extent we can do it in the office. And, I guess what I'm looking for are just kind of like things that really stand out as, oh, that's kind of weird, or that could use some improvement. And sometimes my way of assessing that is more objective, like, okay, you just did a forward bend and your hands didn't get past your knees. Like I can measure that objectively. If they do something that's much more complicated, I might not have any kind of objective way of saying, oh, you didn't meet this standard, but it just might kind of look funny. It might look effortful. It might look uncoordinated. And so that would maybe give me the sense that this is something to work on that might get improvement. It doesn't have you don't have the advantages of your assessment being objective, but sometimes you just have to kind of go with the eyeball test,
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot to be said for just working with a client. You have that sort of time with them, and you notice their behavior, their movement behavior, so to speak, and they have certain things that they might do over and over again, or good or bad habits, and sometimes it just takes time with them to pick up on that.
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's segue into the next topic, and I think this kind of goes well with the baseball example that you brought up earlier, and that's motor development and the primal patterns, and specifically getting into the concept of reversibility. But let's talk about first the motor development, right? And this really starts, as we're infants, as we're babies, and how that can kind of translate into movement as we are a teenager and an adult.
Yeah. So when babies are developing all their movement, they're kind of like learning the fundamental skills first, and those are kind of fundamental building blocks that have to be in place for the more complex skills to be assembled. So you can kind of think of movement as like as a language. Complex movements are assembled from a lot of simple words, and you combine them in various ways to form complex sentences. But in order to do that, you start with the basics. So babies, one of the first things they get is some form of head control. Then they start to get some control of their arms reaching and coming to the mouth, and at some point they can sit up and can control themselves in space. At some point they can crawl, and the skills they learn in crawling are used for walking and stuff like that. The skills they learn in their squatting movements and stuff like that start to, as you get older and you go out on the field and do anything, that kind of basic squat pattern is popping up everywhere. So if there's a problem with your basic squat pattern, it might impact many, many, many different kinds of movements. On the other hand, if you went out and practiced some movement that's not really a developmental fundamental movement and got better at it, it wouldn't necessarily have much carryover to anything else. So if I got really good at playing darts and using my wrist in a really coordinated way to play darts, it wouldn't really help me to do other things. But if I improve my squat, I improve my lunge, maybe that's the kind of thing that you're kind of doing some aspect of that in so many different activities, it would have a lot of carryover and you get better at a lot of other stuff. So that's kind of the idea with developmental movements, is that they're fundamental. And that's why, everyone knows this intuitively. When you go do your prehab, rehab, corrective movement kind of stuff, it's aimed at exactly these types of movements. No one's worried about, how well you play darts or pool when you're doing those rehab movements. It's those fundamental, basic body pattern, postural type things that people work on. For good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, is there, a few fundamental or neurodevelopmental patterns that you find that are like particularly important, that have a big carryover into, the lunge or the squat or rotation, that type of thing?
Well, that's kind of a question I have. I mean, I kind of like it. I like the idea of doing a lot of kind of body flow, rolling around on the floor type of movements. I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner, and these Feldenkrais classes that I sometimes teach, there's a lot of rolling movements. There's a lot of crawling movements. There's a lot of movements in quadruped and transitioning to, bear positions and things like that. I think there's a lot of value in those types of movements. I suspect that they have some sort of carryover into movements, even fundamental movements like when you're standing up, like squatting and lunging. Because like as a baby, they were rolling around before they were squatting and lunging, right? So I suspect maybe there's some sort of value in doing those things. But it's not, I think it's kind of it's a question for me whether people need to get on the ground and roll around or something like that. I think a lot of people will benefit from it. I think that has something to do with those things maybe being in some sense more fundamental than other movements. But it's an area where I'd like to know more about it before I made any claims.
Sure. Now, let's talk a little bit more about like Feldenkrais and being a practitioner, and how that integrates into your practice for yourself and with your clients, and sort of I guess the approach or philosophy behind it for those that aren't familiar.
Yeah. So Feldenkrais is basically a way to teach people how to move better and feel better. So move with more efficiency, less effort, less tension, less awkwardness, and to be more comfortable when you're doing it. And it was invented by a guy named Moshe Feldenkrais, who was a martial artist and a scientist. And he did that in like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And he started teaching people in America to do this in the 70s. And, one way Feldenkrais is taught is like in a class format. So you go to a class and you do these very, very slow, gentle, mindful movements. It's almost like kind of a Tai Chi level of force and speed and mindfulness going on there. And most of the movements are, like I said, you're lying on the ground. One of the classes, every class will be kind of a different functional theme. So one of the classes might be all about reaching. So you might be lying on the floor and kind of slowly reaching your hand overhead, paying a lot of attention to how that feels. Can you feel the scapula moving over the ribs? Does it help you reach further when the ribs open up a little bit? How comfortable is the reach with your spine in different positions, with your hips in different positions? So if the lesson went well, you might try a lot of kind of novel ways of moving through your trunk. You might feel a little bit more efficient or relaxed or less tense when you're reaching, and have kind of like a better sense of body awareness throughout your trunk. So in Feldenkrais, there's, like I said, many different kinds of lessons. One might be about squatting, one might be about rolling or reaching or crawling. What I get out of it is more the kind of basic principles of it than the specific practices. And I think that these same principles you can see them in things like yoga and Tai Chi, anything where you're slowing down movements a lot, really kind of looking for a quality of movement, looking for efficiency in your movement, looking to avoid pain or discomfort when you're moving, and basically generating a sense of body awareness. I think that's the basic idea between all sorts of different interventions that look to, help people with their movement quality.
So would you say that because part of the emphasis is going on very slow, that it not only helps increase awareness of how you're moving, but can really help to develop or, correct, bad movement patterns?
Yeah, so let's say you've got a movement pattern that for some reason is just infected with too much tension. Just whenever you do this movement, you're doing something which is creating a minor amount of stress. You're working harder than you need to. Maybe you're co-contracting or something. You just always do it. But it's only just a small, minor amount, and it's not enough to really recognize unless you really, really go slowly. And then if you go slowly as you're doing a movement, let's say rolling over, you know how people can roll from their front to their back, and they can do it really kind of quickly and not with that sequencing and rhythm. Like I think that, FMS interventions have people roll, and it's not just about, hey, can you roll from your front to your back? It's can you do it with this kind of sequencing and rhythm and timing that shows that you're kind of not working too hard as you do it. So you'll only figure that out if you go really slow. If you move fast and with a lot of force, you're always going to move in a way that's pretty habitual. The whole thing's going to be done before you get a chance to kind of notice anything interesting about it. Like maybe there's too much tension or force there. So if you do movements really slowly, it gives you a chance to notice things that you might not notice normally, to try new things, to make new mistakes and start kind of exploring the movement. But if you always go fast and with force, you'll probably always just use your totally habitual way of doing it. And now you need to, for most of the things in life, we do need to move fast and with force. That's what we're interested in. But sometimes it's cool to break it down and go slow, explore it, and then build it back up.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. And it kind of, I think, can be a very sort of revealing experience because it makes you be much more present and you realize, wow, I might have like a lot of inefficiencies I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, I grit my teeth whenever I do that. Why do I do that? I don't need to do that. Do I need to do that? Things like that. Oh, you have people do these movements in Feldenkrais where, maybe you're on your back and you just kind of move your pelvis in a circle. A lot of people hold their breath. They contort their face. There's a lot of tension in their hands. So things change a little bit when you kind of let that stuff go. Feldenkrais called that parasitic tension that really isn't related to your movement goal. So it's like a parasite on the goal. So when you let that go, maybe you kind of chill out a little bit with respect to that movement. It's almost like you're protecting yourself against something bad happening when you just move your pelvis around, but there's no need,
Yeah, no, that's great. Those three really good examples of, an individual, how they might create tension subconsciously and not even be aware of it, squeezing their fist, holding their breath. And then the third one might be like, contorting or scrunching up their face.
Yeah, all kinds of ways, co-contractions, just all sorts of excessive tension. I mean, generally, when you go from the novice level of doing something to the expert level, you're taking away all these unnecessary muscular contractions. So like a really good golf swing is characterized by muscles only firing when they need to and then turning off and getting out of the way and relaxing and inhibiting themselves when they don't need to, because that's just going to put the brakes on the movement. So you watch people run or swing golf clubs or throw, and it's really the skill of relaxation is really what it's all about. Beginners and novices are kind of contracting everything at the same time and getting in the way of themselves. So I think in a big way, getting better at stuff is about inhibiting unnecessary tension.
Yeah, and learning to let go.
And yeah, learning to let something go. It's just like that wonderful Frozen song.
Awesome.
I've got two young girls, so I've had to hear that a lot.
So they're playing a lot of I guess the pop teen music in the house, huh?
Yeah, I think they're out of the Frozen stage now, thank God. But I did have to hear that song a couple thousand times at some point.
Oh man, that's brutal. Okay, so one of the concepts that you bring up in the book, A Guide to Better Movement, is tying into Michael, and correct me if I mispronounce his last name, Michael Merzenich, is that right?
I think Merzenich, yeah. I'll go with Merzenich.
This idea of stereotypy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is the...
Now, that's the one I don't know how to pronounce correctly. Stereotypy or stereotypy? I don't know. I don't even know what it means. No. Go ahead with your questions. Sorry.
No. So just why stereotypy or stereotypy is the enemy in regards to movement?
Yeah, so I mean, Merzenich is a neuroplasticity researcher, and so that means he's very interested in how the brain changes to help you acquire new skills and stuff like that. And he's kind of talks with the Feldenkrais community from time to time because they share similar perspectives on the importance of variability, your ability to vary your movement or your thinking or your responses to any changes in the environment, because you could be a very good mover in terms of, he talks about getting from A to B. He says it's more important to be able to get from point A to point B in 100 different ways than one way, even if that one way was kind of perfect. So you can imagine someone being very good at squatting down to the ground in this one orientation perfectly, having perfect form. according to Merzenich and the Feldenkrais perspective, that might not be as good of a thing as someone that could squat down to the ground in 20 different ways with lots of different foot orientations, with different orientations of their chest, their pelvis, whatever. I mean, you watch kids who are, supposedly the champion squatters, according to many people, and they are pretty good at it. When they squat down to the ground to look at something, they do it in tons of different ways. They're not always doing it the same way. They drop down one way, they drop to the left, they drop to the right, their feet are all in different positions, their knees flop over to one side or the other. So they have incredible variability. And so there's this kind of growing idea that being very variable in your movement and resourceful in your movement and adaptable in your movement might be a more important quality in determining your real life performance than just your conformance to this one ideal. Because when you go out there in the field, you're going to, or meet an opponent or do anything in real life, you're always going to be presented with totally different and unexpected changes in the environment. And it's your ability to be adaptable and resourceful that's really important. You can't just tell that your opponent, hey, I'm really only good at moving at this exact angle right now. You need to move it. He's going to make you move it at 100 different angles to get the job done.
Right. So the integrating a lot of movement variability into, your training or your individual practice not only helps you move better, but it can help you become a better athlete.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of helps with compliance with doing your hard work. There's many strength coaches I know that advocate kind of a same but different type of approach to being in the gym. So today we're going to do squats or lunges in almost every workout, but it's always going to be a little bit different. We'll use a different foot position. We'll use a different way of loading it. We'll use different reps and sets. Even when you're doing something repetitive, having little differences in the way you do it is beneficial. Even runners who are always running, well, they'll run long distances, they'll run slow distances, they'll run one pair of shoes, they'll run in another pair of shoes. They'll change their speeds, their cadences, whether the terrain they're running on, and that all has a little bit of value in varying the stress, teaching you different things, and yeah.
Awesome. So just to kind of back up, so you touched on Merzenich and neuroplasticity, and after reading your book, one of the big themes that I kind of walked away with is, one, the importance of the central nervous system in the human body and how it relates to movement, and how it is such a fundamental driver in how we do things. And you make this very great and eloquent point that, if we're getting a change to happen, for example, a toe touch, and we use whatever. It might be a foam roller. It might be some sort of corrective exercise, but the change is inherently coming from the nervous system, taking the brakes off, so to speak, and allowing that person in a greater range of motion rather than we're changing the physical, tissue structure. Yeah.
I think that there's a big idea out there that when you see a change in length, or a change in range of motion, you have done something to the local tissues that are involved there. You melted them, or you broke adhesions, or you improved tissue quality, or something like that. But a better explanation for a quick change in range of motion, like you'd get in one session after a quick intervention, is just that the nervous system has chilled out on allowing this range of motion to happen. So, the nervous system has a lot of control over what obviously has complete control over which muscles fire when and how much. If you're doing a forward bend and you're not going very far, part of the reason might be that your tissues are actually short, right? Mm-hmm. But another reason might just be the nervous system's not letting you go there. It doesn't want you to go there. It thinks something's going to rip. Something's going to stretch. It won't allow certain muscles to relax to let you go there. So if you get more range of motion quickly, there's not really any good mechanism to change the tissues in that amount of time. Fascia changes very slowly in response to a lot of stress. The studies on fascia is that you're not going to be able to deform it into a different shape with the kind of forces that you can apply with a foam roller. You would need a scalpel to do that. And it's a good thing too, because if you could somehow elongate or deform your fascia or break adhesions in it just by rolling on a foam roller. I mean, think about it. That would be really bad, because every time you sat in a chair or got on a foam roller, you'd be like turning your body into goo. I mean, we would have to be made of stronger stuff than that. If you think that a foam roller can break an adhesion, you should be scared of getting on one because it might be breaking apart fascial connections that you want there. I mean, those connections are good. We've got it everywhere, and it provides the structure of our body. It shouldn't be breaking down just by getting on foam rollers or getting massages or something like that. Right. Something like that. But what can happen is you can chill the nervous system out a little bit. The nervous system is very responsive, very adaptable. It can change in a second. And it can change your range of motion in a second, not by a ton, but by a little bit. So when you see quick changes, think nervous system, not issues in the tissues.
Very cool. I like that quote a lot. And you touched on kind of our next topic and went into it beautifully, which is the idea of the nervous system perceiving a threat. And you talked about, for example, trying to bend over and touch your toes, and the nervous system doesn't allow you to access that range of motion for whatever reason. But let's talk about the idea of, perceived threat and how that affects, movement across the board.
Yeah. So, I mean, your nervous system coordinates all of your movement. It's making all these decisions. This all happens unconsciously. I think this is why it's a little bit hard to understand. We're not sitting there when we walk around. We're not consciously thinking, gee, I need to really activate my, peroneus longus on this next step because the last one I didn't, but something in you is doing that. And it's your nervous system unconsciously figuring out everything that has to happen. So it's very concerned about you performing your functional goals and, winning the trophy or running fast or catching the ball or something. But it's also very, very, very concerned with you not getting hurt. As much as you personally, like in your conscious mind, don't care about getting hurt, your nervous system does, and it's constantly protecting you against perceived threats. So it's always monitoring potential threats in the body. It's gathering sensory information, and it's figuring out, is there inflammation here? Is there too much stretch there? Is there bad balance here? Is there too much force there? This knee, I remember we heard it last year, and now there's a lot of force going through it. So it's always trying to figure out how dangerous is stuff that's going on in the body and taking protective action. And it can take protective action in many different ways. The most obvious way is pain. It creates pain to warn you of a potentially dangerous situation in your knee. Hey, you've been running on this thing for 3 miles. There's inflammation down there. I'm going to make it hurt and shut you down and tell you to stop running. But it can also do it by making you feel weak and inhibited. So let's say you're doing some motion and you want to apply a lot of force there. If the nervous system perceives, and that's kind of dangerous to have a lot of force going through that area, what's it going to do? It's going to kind of reflexively inhibit you or shut you down or make you a little bit weaker in that area. So if you inject people with a saline solution into their quads or their knee and make it painful, they don't apply as much force next time you do a knee extension. Obviously, the nervous system is going to shut down forces it considers dangerous. It's going to shut down ranges of motion it considers dangerous. So if you are doing some sort of a forward bend and you're not getting very far, it's partly because maybe the nervous system's thinking something's going to rip. The balance isn't good. One of the ways you increase a forward bend is you have people shift their butt backwards to give them better balance. Better balance is going to equal more range of motion. Not having the butt go backwards, you're going to be bending forward. You can almost be falling forward, so you're not going to fall. You're not going to get very far. Endurance is possibly this way as well. There's something called the central governor model of endurance, and it says that part of what shuts you down when you get tired is the brain monitoring signals from the body and thinking, we've been working too long, too hard here. Something bad's going to happen. So the ultimate limiting factor is the brain saying, we're not going to work anymore. It's not necessarily the muscles running out of energy. That's why you can always run faster right when you get to the finish line, because the brain says, okay, that's the finish line. We'll let you run a little bit faster now. It's almost over.
Yeah, I love that concept from Dr. Timothy Noakes, correct?
Yeah, Noakes.
Yeah, and again, it goes right back to a lot of what you discuss in the Guide to Better Movement and how that the nervous system is such a big driver in how we move. But two things. One is I think it's important to make the distinction. Like if there's pain, there's a difference between like, pain from a potential injury and then like pain that you might be experiencing if you're running a race and it's a lot of discomfort because, you're 22 miles into a marathon and, you're in the pain cave, quote unquote, and toughing it out. That's different than my knees throbbing and I can no longer, fully go through a full range of motion when I'm trying to.
Yeah, you mean like the pain? You mean like the pain of exertion? Just the pain.
Correct.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that, but you're a rower, right? So you've lived there for a while, right?
Yeah. There's nothing like quite like that towards the end of a 2K where your whole body's screaming for you to just stop.
It's amazing how much you want to listen to that. I have a lot of admiration for the people that can keep going through that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what do you think are some of the principles that we could kind of pull that help us improve movement that we could apply to that mental aspect of performing in any sport? When it gets tough and our brain's telling us like we need to stop. And I'm talking about the discomfort, not pain, injury. Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a guy named, I'm not sure this answers your question, but I know that there's more people getting interested in this central governor idea of endurance sports. And what they're interested in is, okay, if the brain is acting like a governor on my running ability, and that's ultimately the limiting factor on my endurance capacity, is there a way for me to loosen up that governor, to chill it out, to give me a little bit more stuff? And there's a writer named Alex Hutchinson who wrote a great book called, I'm forgetting the name of the book, but check out Alex Hutchinson's writing in the Globe and other places. He writes a lot about basically training the governor. So part of the idea here is that when you're getting better at running, you're getting better at endurance training. Part of what's happening, of course, is the body's getting more efficient at dealing with the energy output requirements. But another thing of what's happening is the brain is getting better at listening to those signals of threatening situation coming from the body and basically kind of being zen about and saying, it's okay. We're not going to die. We've been here before. And so I mean, you guys, endurance people, know that the mental game of these things is huge. Right. And dealing with your motivation and dealing with the way you process those fears and threats and anxieties as you're running is a big part of the performance. And I think it's an interesting question about whether, performance, to what degree it's in the brain versus the body. And of course they work together. Yeah. No,
absolutely. Yeah, they work together, but it's kind of, it's really cool to hear that. I'll definitely check out Alex Hutchinson. But it's interesting to see how far we could take it to open up, our abilities even further.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Hopefully, they're continuing to make some strides in that area and develop research or different types of methodologies that we could start implementing to expand.
Yeah, there is some research on it. I think Alex has done some self-experiments and refers to research where people they really just do brain training. I think he does this really kind of boring, sustained, maintaining your focus on something for a long period of time, and then seeing whether that purely mental skill translates to being a better marathoner, because that's what he's interested in, is marathoning. So you totally take the body adaptation out of it, just train your ability to focus and say, hey, does this make me a better runner? I'm not sure what the research is showing, but there may be something there.
No, that's cool. Yeah, I'll check that out. That's very interesting. Okay. So another, it's not necessarily a concept, but one of the things that was great in the way that you laid out the exercises in the book, and I love this framework, I thought it was beautiful, was each exercise you had sort of an execution, the steps that you needed to perform.
Yeah.
And then before that was where you're focusing your attention and the intention. So what your mind should be thinking about, and then how you should be feeling that movement in your body and what you should be paying attention to. And so why, again, why is that so important to bring greater awareness and intention to our movement.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're doing, the idea is that what you're doing with your mind, where your attention is, what your intentions are as you're moving, it's gonna have an effect on how much motor learning you get out of it and how much you get out of it. And in a sense, this is pretty common sense. We know that if you focus when you're practicing, focus on what you're doing, you're going to get a better result. You know, the people that are the best in the world at something are very physically skilled, but they're also very mentally skilled. They're very unusual people, and that when they practice, it's very focused, very productive practice. They're not just going through the motions. They're very absorbed in what they're doing. So, paying attention to what you're doing as you're moving is obviously important, and where you direct the attention is important as well. So there's a lot of interesting research on external versus internal cues. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not. It'd be great if you could talk about it, though.
Yeah, so this is the idea that let's say you're doing a vertical jump, and or you're coaching someone that's trying to do a vertical jump, and you tell them, okay, when you do this vertical jump, I want you to powerfully extend your hips. So their attention is going to something that's going on in their body. And then you take another group of people and saying, I want you to touch something. I want you to touch the ceiling, touch something really high. That's an external kind of attention. External attention in motor learning has been shown to be superior to internal attention in many, 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 many different ways. So in a golf swing, if you tell someone, give them internal attention, wind up your chest like that, do this with your arm, do this with your elbow, try to do this with your wrist. That's not going to do as well as someone where you just say, try to hit the target over there, or just pay attention to the club head. That's an external thing to your body. Part of the idea is that you get paralysis by analysis, by really looking at your body as you're moving a lot. I think there's some value to kind of feeling what's going on in your body as you move. But there's also, in many, many situations, more value to thinking about the real functional outcome that you're trying to achieve as you move, because that's kind of more natural way to do things. That's the way to get things done. I think that there's some cases where kind of feeling what's going on in your body is useful, but in a lot of cases, where you direct your attention, like to the goal that you're trying to achieve, is going to lead to a better result.
Yeah, I like that, and I think that's pretty cool. That example you gave, hitting the target versus all the cues of how somebody should move. It changes the intent, but it's also the communication changes the outcome, and it can be very simple.
It changes it. Yeah, if you do this, and one of the examples that I use in my book about how attention affects movement is, you and your listeners are probably familiar with a cat-cow type of movement. That's when you're in quadruped, you're on hands and knees, and you alternately extend and flex your spine. Now, if you do the movement with different areas of attention, you'll do the movement differently. If you do the movement where your intention is to kind of tuck your tail, you'll do it a little bit differently than if your attention is to lower and raise your sternum, which would be a little bit different if your intention was to lower and raise your navel as you're doing the movement. It's kind of the same gross global movement, but slightly different segments will get active and start moving when you give people slightly different cues as they move.
I love that concept that you touched on right there and you talk about in the book. And so is that when you're working with a student or client, is that something that as time goes on you're working with them, you might change, kind of the cue for that individual to try to get them, to have maybe a little bit different emphasis or a different outcome in the movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the skill of coaching movement is very much the skill of what you cue them to do. And I think Nick Winkelman is really the guy that I've been listening to recently, and I keep mentioning him in my podcast. I think he's a good guy in this. He's associated with Exos. And he's very much about using your languaging. And, first of all, he's kind of like, don't say that much. Don't say that much because you can have this paralysis by analysis situation. Give people a task which is going to kind of require them or constrain them to do the right movement. And if they're not doing it right, maybe kind of shift their attention in the right direction. But I mean, just to give an example from my practice, I tend to use the same idea of alternating flexion and extension movements of the spine. You know, imagine someone that's in a sitting position. You can slump all the way down and really flex your spine. You can roll your pelvis forward and really extend your spine. So I have people do that movement a lot, and I'm looking for parts of the spine that are moving a lot and that are moving very little. So there's some parts of the spine that just don't really get included in the movement. I might put my finger right in a part of the person's spine that isn't moving a lot and ask them to feel how much movement's going on there. Just them directing their attention to that area, usually the area will start moving a little bit more. Then I might say, can you push my finger back and forward as you move? Like direct them to move that area more. And usually they can do that. That's just a kind of a very simple example of how where you put your attention affects how you move and how you can cue people differently.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great. And so do you find when you're working with clients, like one of the biggest things that initially you might have to work on is just having them learn or relearn awareness in their body? Because we spend so much time, sitting nowadays and we're not moving as much that you're sort of completely unaware of how you're carrying your body, whether it's like in a slumped over posture or how you're breathing, or that you might be moving a certain area of your body versus another. Yeah,
that awareness thing, that's an interesting question. I think awareness can kind of, maybe it can be kind of a double-edged sword. I have people that come in and they literally have too much awareness of their body. I have people that come in and have no awareness of their body at all. I think that if you want to change a bad habit, sometimes you need to become aware of what's going on in your body to change it. I think that a very internal awareness, like always having a hyper awareness of what's going on in your body, can be counterproductive, because you can, let's say that, there are some people that are, they're almost obsessed with how good their alignment is, how good their posture is. They've learned a lot about what's right and wrong with movement, and they want to pay a lot of attention to make sure they're never making mistakes. That can be counterproductive, because they should be paying attention to the environment and what they need to get done out there. And they'll get it done better if they're not obsessing about what's going on in their body. But if there's someone who's, it's like the example before, like they're gritting their teeth every time they do something, that something's really tense and not useful. You kind of have to get in there and make them aware of that in order to make a change. And then hopefully the change becomes automatic and they can direct their attention back out in the world again where it to some extent belongs. So, it's I think there's kind of pluses and minuses to the awareness thing. The kind of awareness that I want people to have, if they've got it, is a very non-judgmental awareness. Okay, that's what's going on in that area, and that's just what it's doing. Sometimes people's minds leaps immediately to, that's what's going on in that area, and that's wrong, and I've got a herniated disc down there. And so they start to have pain down there because they're worrying about stuff they shouldn't be worrying about.
No, that's a great point. Like just enough awareness so that you know what's going on, but not enough that your attention is redirected to that area, and that sort of is what you become absorbed in.
Yeah. It's where your attention goes matters, and it doesn't always belong in our body, but sometimes it does.
Very cool. Very cool. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on in regards to the nervous system, central governor, being a major driver in movement and everything?
Well, I guess maybe just kind of sum that up a little bit. I think that reducing perception of threat in the body by either getting rid of tissue damage that's there or kind of changing the way you perceive things is a generally good thing. If pain or kind of a perceived dangerous situation in your body can kind of shut you down in a lot of ways. It can make you weak, have poor range of motion, have poor endurance, have poor fatigue, and have pain. Those are all the things that we're trying to get rid of. So I think kind of bottom line, what we're always trying to do is to kind of reassure the nervous system that everything's okay with regard to this movement we're doing. If you can squat and feel very, very safe, you're going to do it better than if you squat and you're having kind of a visceral feeling of that being a dangerous thing to do, and any other movement.
No, that's great. I love that. That's an excellent piece of advice. So before we head into the rapid fire questions, I wasn't sure, is there any, current work or new projects or any events that you want to discuss and make the audience aware so that they could, potentially check you out in person or anything like that?
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything like that coming up in the very near future that I've got any firm dates on, but I guess, stay tuned.
Okay, cool. And I'll be sure
I'm writing some new stuff. I'm talking some places. So I got stuff in the works, but not finalized.
Awesome. Well, I'll be sure to include a link in the show notes to the website and the event section.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. So the last part of all the interviews that I do is kind of a rapid fire with the guest. And these are just some fun questions, helps the audience get to know you a little bit better, not related to the subject matter. So I ask each guest these questions.
So it's just like, Beyonce or Taylor Swift or something like that?
Possibly.
Sorry, I didn't even know this was going to be rapid fire. I'm cool. I'm psyched for it, though.
No, yeah, it's okay. All right. Okay. Given your current knowledge level and your experiences, if you could go back in time 10 years, what advice would you give Todd Hargrove 10 years ago?
Oh, that's interesting. 10 years ago, what advice would I give me? That's such a good question. That makes me want to give a really good answer. I don't know. I think that maybe be a little bit more discerning in the things and the kind of evidence I would accept as being solid evidence. Because when I started reading out there and in the internet, there's a lot of people support their point of view with cherry-picked evidence. You can find evidence that supports almost any point of view, at least some, right? And you could ignore all of the evidence that doesn't support it. So I think I would advise myself to be a little bit more careful about that and look for evidence that's been very robust, that's been replicated, that the top experts in the field agree with. Yeah.
Very cool. I like that a lot. Okay, what is your favorite strength training exercise?
Well, I don't know if I could pick a favorite, but sorry, I'm always doing, your kind of, excuse me, voice training. That's what I need to do more of is voice training exercises. But I like squats, lunges, deadlifts, push-ups, pushes and pulls, vertical and horizontal pushes, just like your basic 6 or 7 movements. And personally, whenever I go to the gym, I'm going to do some of those, and I'm going to vary them. I'm going to do them with dumbbells. I'm going to do them with barbells. I'm going to do them with heavy weights. I'm going to do them with light weights. In fact, I'm only going to do them with light weights. I'm not going to do anything with heavy weights because I'm not strong enough to do anything with heavy weights, but heavy for me. I'm going to do them fast. I'm going to do them slow. So I just think in terms of those really, really basic movements and varying them. And for me, I mean, Eric Cressy's got a good line. I think it's him, is that, good exercise is corrective exercise. And I totally agree. Doing those exercises with good form, mindfully, variably, for me, keeps me feeling very, very good. I like it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So on that note, how has your training changed today compared to 10 years ago?
10 years ago? Well, I'm becoming much less of a competitive athlete, much more of a recreational athlete. So, I'm 48 now, so I'm slowing down. I never really competed in soccer, although I play a lot of soccer. I did kind of compete a little bit in squash, and I don't really compete now because the young guys are too good. So I'm thinking more about, there's the people say moving better and feeling better. I think I'm a little bit more about feeling better than moving better because there's a little bit of a trade-off. If you want to be competitive at something, you're going to have to you have to feel the occasional aches and pains and stuff like that. And I think I'm putting my priorities now towards feeling less of that and feeling better sitting on the couch at night.
Nice. Yeah, that's important. I mean, as you get older, you want to just be able to move but not enjoy it, like feel good and not be in pain or necessarily.
Yeah, I really enjoy feeling good as I move.
Yeah. Okay. Have you ever had an injury and how has it changed your training if you've had an injury?
Yeah, I've had a ton of injuries. I'm kind of personally, my body is not the most robust thing, so it's very easy for me to get like a little tweak here and there. And I think I've got a lot of. I think that because of my experience in reading lots of other good writers, I'm pretty good at getting over these things. So I very often am out for 2 weeks or 1 week or have to make some sort of adjustment. I think the key thing is just managing the load. And that's something I think I neglected earlier that I'm starting to respect more as an important variable. We look to injury, we look to movement quality as preventing injuries, but it's also just the amount of load that's going on and intelligently managing how much you're working in terms of everything that's going on in your life. And by managing that intelligently, I think it keeps me on the field a lot more than I otherwise would. Working around injuries, I've got a little problem in my ankle, but it doesn't mean I can't squat. Maybe I can't run, but I could do something else. Or I could run just a little bit,
Right. And that's a great point you make about, managing the load and sort of being aware of how much that plays a big factor, whether it's intensity or volume, and then sort of taking a pulse on everything else that goes on in one's life, because that plays a big factor too.
Yeah. And that's just getting to know myself. I don't train other people to do that. This is just me training myself, and I'm not that serious about it, but that's my observation.
Cool. Okay. What's one thing that high school athletes should be doing more of to complement their training and their health?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert there, but one thing that strikes me about, and I don't know if this applies to high school athletes, but to me, these athletes, the early sports specialization, I see this personally. It kind of bothers me. I see this personally with a lot of my friends' kids, and they're specializing very early. They're playing soccer all year round when they're 9 and 10 years old. And on one level, it just makes me feel sorry for these kids. They kind of have to in order to get on the team. When I was young, I played soccer this season. I played 3 sports through high school, and that's fun. I wouldn't have wanted to specialize in one the whole time. So you're seeing earlier psychological burnouts. You're seeing repetitive stress injuries in 11 and 10-year-olds. We didn't see that in 12-year-olds. We didn't see that in my generation. And also, I think in the end, it doesn't even really produce superior athletes. I know there's a lot of research and thinking out there that being involved in lots of sports is really good for your overall athletic development, kind of for those variability reasons I was talking about before. You vary your stress, you become more adaptable. And then, I think the information is it's a good time to specialize around 15 or 16. So I would say for these high school athletes, I would say less specialization, but that's not an easy thing for them to do because it's kind of the whole system's pushing them in that direction,
No, that's a great point. I remember I read an article earlier this year that talked about, higher incidence of Tommy John surgeries in high school baseball players. And it's unbelievable. It's just you're kind of shaking your head. How is somebody that's, in the 14 to 18-year-old age bracket having a major surgery that is kind of, you would think would be geared more towards a professional baseball player who's had a lot more mileage under them.
Yeah. The whole culture is pushing in the direction of that early specialization. It's not just sports, but kids are working harder these days and playing less.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a great point. Okay. What's your best tip to improve improve recovery from a training session?
Recovery tips?
Yeah.
Don't work out for a while. I don't know if I've got any good recovery tips. Get a good night's sleep, eat well, just kind of the same boring stuff. I occasionally see in my Facebook feed some information, recovery tips kind of things come up. I don't think any of those things are knocking it out of the park better than just taking it easy on yourself. Cryotherapy or massages. Those things probably add maybe teeny bit of value, but I think just kind of managing your load and having some downtime is as good as anything else. But yeah, I'm not an expert in that anyway. So
yeah, sometimes just good old fashioned rest and sleep, right?
yeah, right.
Okay, last question, or second to last question. What's your favorite meal? If you had to pick one.
Favorite meal?
Yeah, food.
Favorite meal? Well, anything with meat, potatoes, and vegetable, whatever. Oh, probably maybe a ribeye steak. I'll say a ribeye steak and potatoes and small amount of greens. That would be my favorite meal.
Awesome.
Now wait a minute. There's my recovery question too. Triples the speed of your recovery to have that meal.
Okay, final question, Todd. What's one book everyone should read?
One book everyone should read?
Mm-hmm.
Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Dan Dennett. Well, that's a lot of D's.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if not everyone should read it. I think it's a good book. I like Dennett and Pinker and Dawkins.
So that was called, Darwin's, what was the title?
Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Dan Dennett.
Dangerous Idea. Okay, I'll be sure to include that in the
I don't know if that's really optimized for your listeners. What's a good book?
No, that's okay. It doesn't necessarily have to be towards sports. I'm always curious to see what my guests are reading and stuff. So I try to expand my own personal horizon. So I expand my library as well.
Yeah, good book. I'll throw in one more. How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker. I'd take those two books and throw away my college education.
Wow. That's cool. All right. I'll have to check that one out too. Well, Todd, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your expertise and wisdom.
Thank you very much for having me. Those are great questions, and that was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And hopefully I'll have you on again in the future.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Awesome. So just hang on the line and let me give you a proper goodbye. Thanks for tuning in and listening to that episode of the Leo Training Podcast. If you enjoyed this content, I greatly appreciate it if you would take a moment of your time, head on over to iTunes, and drop in a 5-star review. It really helps the show grow, reach new audiences, and gain greater exposure. Thank you. And be sure to tune in next week for a brand new episode.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.